Hey everyone, and welcome to this Risky Business product demo. My name's Patrick Bray. These product demos give our sponsors a chance to demonstrate some of their products. It's like a show and tell so that you can actually see them in action, which is quite often very helpful. And today joining us is Ryan Kalember. He is the Executive Vice President of Cybersecurity at Proofpoint, and we are going to be talking about what they call the People Risk Explorer. Ryan Kalember, welcome.
Thanks. Great to be here, Pat. And also great to be digging into people-centric risk, vulnerability, and all that good stuff.
Now, of course, this is something that we've spoken about on the show before, how you can pull together a whole bunch of different data sources and start figuring out like who's being attacked, and also figuring out stuff like who's most likely to click on dangerous links and things like that. And then you can start doing stuff with that data. But I guess seeing is different to talking about it, right? So let's pull up your screen now and you can start walking us through it.
Yeah, absolutely, Pat. And as we've talked about a number of times, the whole idea for us was to try and actually quantify things around people risk. There are things like the Verizon DBIR that talks about 85% of all breaches involving a human element, but even that's a little bit squishy. Within an organization with different groups of people, all of whom are attacked a little differently, all of whom behave a little differently, and all of whom actually have access to slightly different things. What we wanted to do is actually move into quantifying that, which for us, of course, starts with who's getting interesting attacks, which of course is going to be the bulk of the risk that most organizations are dealing with.
And of course, this is something that's quite easy for you to pull together. I mean, as a major email filtering provider, and with most attacks still coming in via email, it gives you some pretty decent insight, doesn't it, into who's getting what?
Oh, absolutely. And even before we bubble it up from both a targeted email and a targeted cloud attack perspective, which I'll get to in a second, obviously you do want to be able to differentiate interesting attacks from less interesting attacks. So this is obviously demo data, but we've got a software engineer here who's actually got our most interesting threat right now. If we were to dig into what we think is actually interesting, it's not this generic bit of credfish right here, but oh, here's one that's interesting. It's Cobalt Strike, or Kobe Strikey, as our threat research team likes to call it. Obviously, you can drop ransomware. You can do a lot of other bad things with Cobalt Strike. So this is a relatively high scoring one, even though this is not extraordinarily highly targeted. It's going to 70 plus other organizations. That's the sort of thing that will get you into this category that we call very attacked people, which, of course, has a lot of people you'd expect, like this president and CEO here, who not only is getting a lot of interesting attacks, but has also clicked on them, which is not what you want to see.
No, and of course, you can't see that just by being an email filtering provider. So it might make sense for you to also, tell the people watching this how you know when someone is actually clicking on dangerous stuff.
Absolutely. And the clicking part in terms of non-simulated real attacks obviously does come from rewritten URLs. So the email protection system can rewrite URLs either to open an isolated container or simply rewrite them so that we know when somebody's clicked on something that we then sandbox at click time and deem to be malicious, which is where this data is coming from.
Telemetry.
Telemetry is delicious. And it also makes it much easier to figure out what this attacker is likely to be after, of course. Pairing that up with things that we get from, in this case, this is an Office 365 demo tenant, where we'd get something like a title, something like department, OUs, Active Directory group memberships. All of these other things help us kind of understand broadly that our president and CEO here, who really shouldn't be clicking on things and is now actually showing some potentially compromised activity with this cloud account, is also someone we need to worry about because of the places that they are organizationally and what that then gives them access to.
Yeah, I mean, it is. This is the sort of stuff people talk about theoretically being able to do. What's interesting here is you've actually done it, I guess.
Absolutely. Yeah. And it's been a journey, right? We started talking about this idea almost 5 years ago now, where the first step was, can we actually figure out who's getting targeted differentially? And the telemetry is really key in that. Obviously, email is an incredibly useful source because it is almost by definition targeted if you can figure out what's a campaign and what's not a campaign. But cloud actually turned out to be really useful as well, where we could see things. And I looked at this one ahead of time. This is a less obvious title, retirement desk relationship consultant, but hey, that's somebody who's a financial advisor, can actually probably do some interesting things. This is not someone who's actually clicked on a malicious email, maybe not even someone who's actually targeted by a tremendous amount of malicious email, but there's a cred pair out there for them. There's challenging looking, potentially compromised activity on that account. And there is an OAuth app or a consent-based phishing potential indication here with a third-party app connected to this person's account. You can get to that level targeting.
Yeah, it would make sense at this point to sort of explain to people where that information is coming from, because it's obviously not coming through email. So this is basically you're pulling this data from the O365 or M365 API, right? The Graph API.
Exactly. So this is all coming from Graph API or the Google Workspace equivalent, where we have that.
Isn't it funny? By the way, I've done so many of these interviews with people who do these products that interface with those APIs, and they always call it Graph API and the Google equivalent. Google, you need to name this thing. You need to give it a snappy name, because being called the Google equivalent all the time, terrible branding.
Absolutely. And you never want to be defined by what Microsoft thinks about something, especially when it's a really useful API. But yes, that's exactly where we're getting it. But just to be clear, this is actually not even a product we sell. You get this with all of the Proofpoint core packages, because connecting to the Graph API has been a way for us to make the core email threat protection and the cloud account protection better for, of course, quite a while.
Yeah, so that is worth pointing out, right? That this is, I think it's every enterprise level product, right? You get this.
Yes, exactly. These are, we call them P bundles. If anything P0 and above gets you access to this. And so one of the things that you might actually get if you had some of the other pieces of kind of human-centric telemetry is a broader view of not just who's getting interesting attacks, because obviously all people being attacked aren't necessarily an equal level of risk, but you want to also identify people who are likely to click on that phishing attack or install that risky third-party app or whatever the social engineering actually entails that they would do. Vulnerability for us, though, is something that we try and construe pretty broadly. And in this case, this organization has a lot of people who are, in this case, repeat clickers. They're clicking more than once in a month period. You've got people who are installing those risky third-party apps, the consent phishing piece. You've got people who are showing potentially compromised activity on their cloud accounts. Usually that's a single-digit number, and hopefully it's a single-digit number. But then, of course, you've got the things that you mentioned earlier that are a little bit more predictive. Somebody who failed a phishing simulation is a good example. Somebody who's not done any of their training. Somebody who's got something in the Have I Been Pwned API for a credential just being out there. There's lots and lots of other things, even including things like generating DLP alerts or data loss prevention alerts. All of those can be indicators that someone is just not taking the same standard of care as their coworkers might when it comes to the basics of cybersecurity hygiene.
Now, I think you've already done a pretty good job of explaining, what this console can give you, which is a list of people who are both, exhibit risky behavior and are targeted a lot, and that is that's just not a great combination. The question becomes then, what do you do with this information? Because it's all well and good, and I've seen products in the past where, they might give you some interesting information, but then so what, right? What do you then do about it? So, you've got all this information, then what?
It's a great question. At the core of this is the idea that, security should not be a one-size-fits-all sort of proposition. So if you can actually get down to controls that you would really want to implement for your riskiest people, you don't have to do something that actually scales to thousands and thousands and thousands of people. So in this organization, to your point, we just narrowed down from 17,000 total people to about 167 of which are both vulnerable and attacked at the same time. So the tool itself will recommend things that will quantifiably reduce risk based on the models that we see. One, obviously, making sure we lock down those cloud accounts, controlling some post-compromise activity like mail forwarding rules that attackers, especially those BEC guys, are very fond of, getting into tighter policy from an email perspective, either isolating those links rather than just sandboxing them, or simply dialing them into a tighter policy group, locking down logins by geolocation, making sure that, again, those isolation pieces work, and then even doing some things that are not terribly scalable, like look at actually isolating all that person's browsing. Look at what permissions that particular user has and can you actually reduce them, and make sure that they have things like EDR on that box, or if you really wanted to take this farther than what the tool suggests, making sure you've got a YubiKey for people that are the top targets of phishing. You might not be able to do that
and
for
again
10,000.
I mean, this is the thing, right? You're talking about 17,000 users, and even if you just take that core group of people where they're kind of likely to get owned and people are trying to do it, being able to do stuff like, even the geo-restricted logins is something that if you try to put on 17,000 people, you remember a few years ago where I think it was a water treatment plant somewhere in the United States, called in like a Russian ICS attack, and it turned out it was one of their admins who was on holiday in Russia, who like logged in via Citrix or whatever, and So, but this actually makes geo-restriction quite useful, I would think.
Or exactly, because you're dealing with different chunks of the population. And you can also, and this is one of the things that I think most of the security leaders that I've talked to who are heavy users of this actually really like, you can have a more business-oriented conversation here. You're not just saying, okay, there's this form of abstract technical risk.
You've mentioned this to me in the past, which is this thing just spits out awesome PowerPoint fuel, right? When you want to go talk to the board.
Right, exactly. And you have people actually, oh, I know that person, or I know that group, and they can make sense of what the risk looks like for, oh, if that person were owned or if that group were compromised, this is what it would actually mean for our organization. Being able to kind of shift that conversation is almost as useful as being able to narrow down a set of technical controls on the people that are most likely to need them. They're both obviously quite valuable, but it's the soft power side of security occasionally is not well served by some of the data we produce. This data, though, turns out to be really useful for that, because if you really wanted to then take it to the next step, you can compare risk by levels of seniority. Are your executives more risky than your VPs versus your managers versus your contractors? And everyone's evaluated by the same standard, so it's a very fair evaluation. You can even look at, is desktop engineering riskier than IT versus the admin team or the finance group, and surprisingly, IT does actually tend to click on a lot of stuff. You'd be surprised at how often that happens, but it's a very organizational, human intelligible, non-technical way to take cybersecurity risk and map it to things that more people can understand.
Well, you were talking about that whole, soft skill thing in information security, and one thing I like about this is you can protect users without making them feel bad, right? Like if you go to a particular user and say, hey, we think your account is at risk, you don't have to tell them it's because you keep clicking on everything. You can leave that part out. But the idea is, you can tell them, hey, we're going to kick you into this different user group. We're going to give you some special software and this YubiKey to help keep you safe. I mean, if anything, you're making them feel special, not stupid, right? And that's valuable.
That is incredibly valuable in practice. And it's not even complicated psychology. When you tell somebody they're special, you're immediately communicating things that are very positive. They want the VIP protection package. You can obviously kind of put a little spin on this, brand it a little differently, and you're getting people to adopt security controls that not only align to technical risk, but actually are likely to not be perceived as a burden and not be perceived as, this is the security team making my life harder. They're giving me VIP protection because I'm special. People are interested in me and what I have access to. I'm important. It just works. And
so you don't tell them you're actually putting them in the padded room. You tell them that they're special and they're getting the VIP package.
Exactly. And the other good thing about looking at security risk the same way that you look at the normal organizational units, no matter what kind of organization you do security for, is that it can be coherent even if maybe you have country by country risk that's different. I was talking actually to a CISO who is at a global pharma, and he's got radically different risk in his Egyptian operations versus his German operations versus his UK operations versus his US operations. He's got different laws he has to deal with. He's got different levels of risk, and it's difficult to explain things in relative terms most of the time in cybersecurity. And you might actually then also, just want that basis for conversation from the executive standpoint to compare, this organization is pretty US and India centric, so this is the most interesting data. But if you were able to actually say, hey, this region, this acquired company, this whatever it happens to be, is where our risk is coming from. Let's spend more time there. It's just a really business aligned conversation to have that helps you get what you want to get done from an agenda perspective, just in a way that really kind of maps to what the business wants to do as well.
Yeah, I mean, it's about how to allocate resources, right? And if you could actually produce a tool that tells people how to do that, and obviously, this isn't this doesn't tell you anything about your infrastructure risk. But you've given it that name, Nexus People Risk Explorer, right? It's not infrastructure risk or overall risk explorer, but it certainly does help with that, resource allocation and question and how to treat different groups of users based on their risk.
Exactly. And, most of the things that we're dealing with people tend to be, the left side of the attack chain, right? We want to obviously take pressure off the downstream controls and make sure the downstream controls are in the places they can do the most good. So, making sure EDR is on the very attacked people's boxes is a good example of that. But really, the last thing I want to kind of show from a demo perspective is, how do you make this less generic? How do you make it actually correspond to risk the way your organization views it? So obviously country risk could be something where, Egypt's a 10, the UK's a 6, Germany's 8, whatever it happens to be. But for most organizations, it's going to be something like this. And, you don't actually have to have Active Directory in good shape. You don't have to have a fantastic identity management or governance system in place, although we do integrate with like the SailPoints and CyberArks of the world to get this data. But we actually just built an ML model that sorts people into the groups that everybody has. So this organization has a finance team, obviously a legal team, an executive team, an IT team, a purchasing team. And you will see, obviously, cyber criminals have a preference for attacking finance titles and purchasing titles. That's not going to be revolutionary. But if you can even just go in here and basically say, these are the people that I'm interested in, and I'm going to give it a arbitrary kind of 1 to 10 rating. And if there's something that's a little specific within that, and in this case, this organization has a bunch of AED groups that basically mean you have access to customer data, you can spend 5 minutes here and actually get really, really strong signal out of the data that you've made really specific to your own organization. So it's not just a purely generic view of risk. You've captured something very fundamental to what you care about and what type of data access you'd actually most want to defend.
Yeah. So it's not like a template-based approach where it's, IT gets this much and finance gets this much. It's much more customized. I get it.
Yeah, I mean, and even using the generic view, you're going to get interesting data because obviously there's distinctions in terms of how people are attacked, and everybody's got different people engaged in riskier behavior or simply committing more human errors than others. I've committed many human errors just in the process of recording this demo, and I wouldn't want to blame anybody for that, but it plays out differently at every single organization. So even if you use the generic weightings that are in there, that's pretty useful just to get a start. But if you actually go in and spend a minute saying, all right, I really, really care that finance doesn't get popped, or I really care about this particular R&D unit that has access to the data I really care about. If you go through that exercise, which should frankly take you more than an hour, if you've already done that kind of thinking about risking your organization, you do get a much better result from a modeling perspective.
Well, that actually leads me into my sort of final question around this, which is how are people using it? It's not a SOC tool, right? Like it's not a tool that you stick an analyst in front of and they're watching it 24/7. Is this I imagine, and you tell me, that this is the sort of thing, the sort of console that people fire up every now and then. They might take a look at that front page once a week and see if that group of imminent targets has just ballooned. That might make sense. But by and large, this is something that you periodically hit up and mine for data. Is that about right?
Yeah, that's very spot on. And there's some things that, of course, can happen in an automated sense. So for most Proofpoint users, your very attacked people will be automatically enrolled in link protection, whereby their clicks are isolated as opposed to just happening normally. And of course, you can do things like trend this over time. But to your point, making sure that there's no radical spikes in the amount of risk that the model is calculating is quite useful. But really, it's kind of about those two big broad things, making sure that the simple, straightforward controls that we all know we should do, MFA, EDR, et cetera, apply to our riskiest users. That's kind of step one. And a lot of that has also extended to DLP use cases more recently. And secondly, that you do have that very, very straightforward understanding of how am I going to take this cybersecurity risk that I'm identifying in cloud and email and other places and use that to articulate business risk. People do check in on that periodically because it will shift, right? If I go back to a good example from recently, healthcare provider here in the U.S. They look at physicians, they look at radiologists, they look at administration and the payment side of things. Those groups can absolutely shift pretty markedly in terms of the types of risks they're being subject to, and very often that's due to M&A or some other thing that's happening with the organization that doesn't often get captured in our cybersecurity metrics. So that's the other
Yeah,
thing.
we've spoken about this before too. Like in an M&A scenario, this is pretty useful. Like I know, obviously I've been reporting on InfoSec for 20 years, so I know quite a few CISOs and, a lot of them who've worked through M&As, and that's, quite often the source of a lot of their angst, particularly the CISOs I know who work for large technology companies who gobble up other technology companies. And I think one of my favorite quotes from one of them was like, they might acquire some startup or something, and then they start integrating it and just say, "Oh my God, how are you sleeping?" But this is a good way to get your arms around a lot of that risk pretty quickly. Just quickly, Ryan, though, I wanted to ask you. So I'd imagine you get some level, the bulk level of the value would come from just mining the email data. Then one step above that, you might have the next most valuable thing you can add to that is the API data from from Microsoft, Graph API or the Google equivalent. And beyond that, you mentioned integrations with DLP. You obviously offer a DLP product, but I'd imagine even if you're just using the email side of it and you're using cloud email and then you plug in the API, I'd imagine that's still on its own going to give you the bulk of the value here, right?
Yeah, that'll give you about 80% of it. The other real common source of telemetry is security awareness training tools and phishing simulation. Obviously, Proofpoint is in that space as well. That's something that comes integrated by default. So depending on how much stock you put in simulated phishing and how well people are performing on their training,
well, I was going to say, the fact that this product exists tells you what you need to know about, the efficacy of phishing training. It doesn't mean you shouldn't do it, but I think expecting it to get you much further than baseline might be a bit of wishful thinking.
True. And it also then kind of guides that training program. So we know that the hours that we ask for from people, especially across 17,000 of them, as in this example, are precious. So if you want to target things like an awareness training program, the specific form of outreach from the security team, you want to have that really aligned to risk that you've identified, behaviors they've identified as risky. And that's another good way to make sure that people aren't going through training who don't really need it. So being able to tailor that is another benefit.
All right, well, Ryan Kalember, thank you very much for joining us to walk through Nexus People Risk Explorer. Very snappy. I think, look, if you're a Proofpoint customer, you have absolutely no reason not to go and look at this. I understand that the majority of Proofpoint customers who are doing this type of mail filtering for cloud email already have integrated API access, right? So you're going to get a lot of value by just using this free tool that you've put together. I think obviously it's a sweetener for people who might be looking for an email security provider. But look, great demo, very interesting stuff. Thank you so much for joining us to walk us through it. Cheers.
Thanks, Matt. It's a pleasure as always.